Then a second event occurred amidst the devastation of the Twin Towers in New York, when another building that formed part of the World Trade Center complex, known as Tower 7, suddenly and without warning collapsed hours after the attack.
We're going to roll that tape for you. This is World Trade number 7 collapsing.
Its 47 floors disintegrated almost in free fall, taking less than 6 seconds. Conspiracy theorists claim Tower 7 was brought down deliberately by a controlled demolition, an allegation backed by a group of 3,400 building professionals called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. The leader of the group is Richard Gage.
The truth about 9/11 is a wake-up call for all of us. The explosive evidence and eyewitness testimony reveals to us not only controlled demolition, but a massive false flag operation, a massive series of lies from our government.
Well, I spoke to Jonathan Barnett, CEO of Basic Expert and one of the world's leading fire structural engineers. Barnett was an expert witness in the US government's central investigation into the collapse of the Twin Towers and gave evidence to the US Congress. In all the investigations, and you said you looked deliberately, any evidence for a controlled demolition, what would you have needed to have found?
We would have looked for steel that had been pre-cut. We would have looked for steel that had been damaged in an explosion, which is different than steel that's been damaged from the forces induced by a falling building. We found nothing.
And if you'd seen a conspiracy, you would have called it out?
Of course we would have. And it's something that all of us were strongly dedicated to, finding the truth. This was the size of steel that they used in the construction of Tower 7. They didn't use this particular kind of steel in Towers 1 or Towers 2. So that's why we know its pedigree. It was a surprise to me because it was so eroded and deformed, and so we took it for analysis in the lab.
There's parts where the entire half-inch of the beam is gone, entirely dissolved right through, and so something happened to cause the steel to really thin and in some places to disappear entirely. Well, it was attacked by what we determined was a liquid slag. When we did the analysis, we actually identified it as a liquid containing iron, sulfur, and oxygen.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel, running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like
lava. Like lava
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
There were reports of molten steel having been seen in the rubble pile of all 3 buildings, and I knew that jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, is not capable of melting steel nor iron. Kerosene or jet fuel burns at less than 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and molten steel needs at least 2700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of thermite.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel.
There's a government theory that calcium sulfate from gypsum boards was the source of sulfur, and that's wrong. Calcium sulfate cannot undergo any kind of a chemical reaction that produces the element sulfur, and we're not dealing with any kind of compound of sulfur. When we're talking about sulfidation, we're dealing with the element sulfur.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at Ground Zero. The fires lasted for quite a while, but most importantly, they were deep within the pile, where people would expect that the environment was oxygen starved. And thermite could explain this because it has its own oxidant within. It's actually the metallic oxide that provides the oxidant to allow the incendiary thermite reaction to occur, even underwater.
When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
You must have had a much hotter heat source for you to get 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt the iron to get these molten spheres. Your heat source must be something like a chemical reaction, an exothermic chemical reaction that reacts, in the case of thermite, reacts at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. It's all the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
National Fire Protection Association Guide number 921 calls for saving the evidence and being prepared to justify why you wouldn't. It also calls for testing for accelerants and explosives when high-order damage is involved. And this did not do this.
The manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, and there's videos of it, people can see it, we should test for it. It says when you have melted steel or concrete, you test for thermite.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
In the World Trade Center dust, an international team of scientists find an advanced form of highly energetic nanothermite composites. What is it, and where does it come from?
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips. And in the reaction, they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction, and such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures. What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just two powders being mixed. The material is actually built from the atom scale up. We call it the bottom-up procedure, which is what you do in nanotechnology. the ingredients are much smaller, which means they are reacting faster and they are more easily ignited.
Barnett's team also established the complex preparation that would be needed for a controlled demolition in a building like Tower 7.
That kind of work doesn't happen in an hour or two. It takes many days, and in some buildings, weeks to do. Well, none of that happened on Tower 7.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdome, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Key Span gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts. Then a team of loading experts would have access to all the core columns and beams. The rest could be accomplished at that point by just the right kind of explosives for the job at hand.
There had to be some agent that was destroying the connections in building number 7 at 400 connections per second, and the only thing that I can see that would be capable of doing this would be explosive devices at the connections. And this is why I think that there has to be a new investigation to find out the real physical causes for all these members to act in an atypical fashion.
The Freedom of Information Act request to NIST by a registered structural engineer for calculations and analysis was denied by NIST, with the claim that releasing this data might jeopardize public safety. How could it possibly jeopardize public safety to tell people in the industry, engineers who were responsible for designing these buildings, how this failure could occur?
The minimum explosive charge, the 9 pounds, required to fail critical column IE-79 would have produced a pressure wave that would have broken windows in the north and east, resulted in a sound level of 130 to 140 decibels, which is the equivalent sound to a gunshot blast. There were no witness reports of such a loud noise.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion
inside the lobby.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was some secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion.
We heard a loud explosion.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion.
All of a sudden, you hear explosion, and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. As if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
They're reporting exactly what I would expect. You're hearing boom, 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 waves of explosions going off.
Conspiracy theories just abound after 9/11. What happens? What's going on that people with high intellect, expertise decide something fishy is going on.
Basically, what a conspiracy theory is an attempt to regain some sense of control. And whenever something big happens, right, like 9/11, but even COVID, so we want to have an explanation about us because our worldview is seriously sort of challenged at that moment. So we saw that with Princess Diana. Was it MI5 who killed her? And there are so many conspiracy theories about why JFK, how he was murdered. And the same is actually the case with 9/11. We cannot accept psychologically almost that something as big as this was just caused by a handful of terrorists. And by actually embracing the conspiracy theory, we feel that we're back in control. We understand why the world is and why all of this happened the way that it did.
You must find this galling, James, to think that people do think this wasn't an attack by an enemy.
Yeah, and look, I've obviously heard all the conspiracy theories about that building falling down. To be completely honest, Liz, I'm actually flabbergasted more buildings weren't knocked down.
We've done our best by using the scientific method, examining the evidence from the World Trade Center and developing unbiased conclusions from unbiased experts in their fields.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science is a way of finding out that is self-correcting and involves many people. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
The top section pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building. You're looking for a jolt, that this thing, if it actually comes down and hits, you should be able to see the point at which they actually impact, because it would actually slow down the motion of the falling block. This block accelerates straight down, or it's picking up speed downward continually. It doesn't slow down, it just continues to gain speed. It accelerates the entire time. And that was what was extremely significant. This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight, and here it is falling through it with the resistance of only 1/3 of its weight. Roughly 90% of the resistance has been removed, and what's happening is the top section is not crushing down the lower section like a pile driver, which is the picture that NIST basically is painting. It's actually falling into material that's already been pulverized, that's offering very little resistance. It's just coming down through pre-pulverized material.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
So something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds. And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure.
And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I've estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
We know we've been lied to about 9/11. We don't know for sure who did it. We don't know exactly how they did everything. And that's why we need a new investigation to find out. We do know that there was a massive cover-up, that there was evidence hidden, and destroyed. The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
Well said. Well, thank you all very much for joining us to remember a day that we need to learn from and one the world must never forget.